When I decided to reread Wano specifically to reevaluate Kozuki Oden, I legitimately went into it wanting to change my mind, because clearly I'm in the minority. For a large portion of the fanbase, Oden is legendary and inspirational and honestly one of the most impactful flashback characters in the entire series. So I thought maybe I just missed something. Maybe on a second read I'd see the layers, but instead I walked away more convinced than before that Oden in the grand scheme of One Piece is not a particularly strong character. And that doesn't mean he's badly written, it just means that for how central he is to Wano's emotional foundation, he feels strangely hollow. Almost like a myth that never fully translates into a human being. And that distinction really matters because Oden isn't just a side character, he's the spine of Wano. If he doesn't resonate with you, the entire arc shifts, and for me, that's exactly what happened. From the very moment Oden is introduced, the narrative positions him as extraordinary. He's absurdly strong as a child, he gathers followers effortlessly, he impresses Whitebeard and Roger, and he stands up to Kaido. So every chapter reinforces the same idea, that Oden is incredible. But here's my issue, because we're told that constantly. We are rarely shown meaningful internal growth, because there's a really big difference between watching a character develop into greatness and being introduced to someone who already embodies greatness. And with Oden, we skip the developmental struggle. He never climbs at all, he exists at a high point from the very beginning. And while that can work for legendary figures in a story, it becomes repetitive when so much emotional weight depends on us connecting to him deeply. It starts to feel less like discovery and more like reinforcement. Instead of uncovering layers, we're being reminded of his greatness over and over again until it becomes expected that we accept it. And that is where the disconnect begins. Because Oden at his very core is defined by freedom. He wants to leave Wano, he wants adventure, and he wants the open sea, and that's perfectly fine because that's pretty much what One Piece is about. It's about freedom. But see, the thing that I expected from a flashback that was this long and this central was more internal conflict. More tension between duty and desire. He's the future shogun, his country is suffering, yet his decision to leave is framed almost entirely as romantic, as understandable, as destiny, but emotionally, I never felt the will of that choice. The story acknowledges it, but it doesn't deeply wrestle with it, and there's a difference. Oden's freedom is celebrated more than it's questioned, and because of that, he feels less complex and more symbolic. He becomes an embodiment of a theme rather than a person struggling with that theme. And One Piece, at its best, gives us characters who are both symbolic and human. Robin isn't just about history, she's about trauma and survival. Law isn't just about revenge, he's about lost in trust. Korozan isn't just sacrifice, he's insecurity, failure, and compassion. But Oden, in comparison, feels streamlined. His most prominent flaw is just his naivete, specifically in how he handles Orochi and Kaido. He trusts too easily, he believes promises, he makes decisions based on optimism, but even that flaw is framed more as tragic nobility than genuine character failure. We don't walk away thinking Oden was deeply flawed, we walk away thinking Oden was too pure for a corrupt world. And that framing softens him and protects him from a deeper critique. Another issue I struggle with is how heavily the narrative bends around him. The Scabbards revere him with near religious devotion, and on paper that makes sense because he changed their lives. But the intensity of that devotion sometimes feel more mythic than organic. Whitebeard is impressed quickly, Roger is impressed quickly, and Wano reveres him. When nearly every character in the story treats someone as extraordinary, it can create distance rather than closeness. Because instead of forming our own conclusions, we're surrounded by characters reinforcing the same conclusion. And that repetition makes him feel larger than life, but not necessarily more human. That mythic elevation becomes especially important when you really think and realize how much of Wano's emotional weight rests on Oden. The rebellion exists because of him, the Scabbard's loyalty exists because of him, Momonosuke's identity crisis revolves around him, and even Yamato's entire self-concept is built around him. And that's a lot of narrative gravity for one character. And if that character doesn't emotionally land for you, the arc becomes structurally weaker. But for me, the boiling scene, which is widely considered one of the most powerful moments in Wano, didn't hit as hard as it clearly did for others, but not because it wasn't dramatic, in fact it absolutely was, but emotional impact depends on investment, and I never fully felt invested in Oden as a person. I respected him, I understood him, but I didn't feel him, and that's the difference. When Ace dies, it hurts because we've watched him struggle with identity. When Corazon dies, it devastates us because we've seen his fears, his doubts, and his tenderness. Oden's death is very heroic, but heroism alone doesn't guarantee emotional depth. And that brings me to what I think is the core issue. Oden functions way better as a legend than an actual character. As the man who sailed with Roger and learned the truth of the world, he's monumental, but as an individual on the page, he feels way more flattened by his own greatness than anything. He's too consistently admirable, too consistently brave, and too consistently right in spirit. And while he makes mistakes, they don't fundamentally reshape how we perceive him. If anything else, they reinforce his tragedy. They don't complicate his identity. Compare that to someone like Luffy, who is my favorite character in the story, but even I can admit that he's simple. But the difference between them is that he fails, he doubts, and he makes reckless decisions that cost him deeply. Oden's arc doesn't feel like transformation, it feels like confirmation. We meet him at his peak and then we leave him at his peak. And evidently that works for some readers, but for me, character strength in One Piece has always come from contradictions and tension. From the push and pull between ideals and reality, Oden feels pretty much set for life with himself from start to finish. And because of that, his journey feels more like a straight line than a curve. And that doesn't make him irrelevant, it makes him, as I said, symbolic. And symbols, while powerful, can lack texture. So after rereading Wano specifically to give Oden a fair second look, I didn't come away hating him. I more than anything came away feeling detached from him. I understand exactly why he matters, and I understand why people love the guy, but for me, he doesn't feel as layered as other pivotal characters in the series. He feels like a legend written into history, not a man shaped by it. And when so much of Wano depends on that man resonating deeply, that disconnect becomes noticeable. And you know what? Maybe that's intentional. Maybe Oden is supposed to feel larger than life, but larger than life can sometimes mean smaller in nuance. And in a story as emotionally rich as One Piece, nuance is what makes characters unforgettable. Oden is a lot of things. He's important, he's strong and influential, but compelling isn't one of them. And that's not a popular opinion, but it's an honest one. Anyways, that will do it for today's video. I'll see y'all in whatever I make next. Peace.